Hey guys, thanks so much for joining us tonight for Theology on Tap. My name is Chase Davis, and I'm one of the pastors here at The Well. This is my friend Matt. Matt, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Matt. I'm a pastor at The Well as well. You can tell this is going to be super serious tonight, guys, but that's kind of the goal, is to have a little bit of fun here tonight and dive into some good stuff.
That's right. Our hope tonight with Theology on Tap is to continue something we've been doing really since we planted The Well, which is have hard conversations about hard topics, maybe controversial things. And really our vision is to create a place where we can have conversations about topics that are sometimes controversial, like the Holy Spirit and gifts and charismatic things, or what are some other things that you can remember that we've talked about?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like we've always kind of done that in many ways, but I think that's actually a weird skill set for our church, has been always talking about the things that people say they've never heard talked about before. I think we kind of exist in a stream of churches, primarily Acts 29, Fellowship Associates, that don't shy away from that, but I don't think most people growing up have had the same kind of experiences in church. And so it's actually become something with our church that I actually enjoy a lot, is the kind of the honesty to dive into things. And even just kind of, I guess the right way to say it is the willingness to say, I don't know. And I think we're going to have probably some of that tonight.
For sure. Yeah, there's going to be lots of stuff that really, I like to think of this experience, Theology on Tap. If you've been before, if you haven't been, hopefully when all this coronavirus stuff dies down, we can continue this and you might be able to join. I like to think of it as the after-class hangout with a professor. When you go to the class, you hear the professor kind of lecture about a topic, and then you go to the pub with him afterwards, and you get a beer in him, and all of a sudden he opens up about what he really thinks. And that's kind of the idea with Theology on Tap, is we get to be a little bit more free-form, and so we may make some mistakes tonight in what we say or think, and that's actually to be expected in this kind of platform. It's kind of more of a free-thinking, open-minded discussion about various topics.
Yeah, and Chase is definitely the professor in that scenario he laid out, and I'm just somebody there at the pub already. So
yeah, that's right.
I'm graduating seminary this semester. Chase has already graduated seminary twice, so if anything's wrong, you can email him.
That's right. Well, tonight, the topic we're going to discuss, and like I mentioned, we've discussed various topics from political theory to the resurrection of Jesus, and we'll have professors come do Theology on Tap as well. But tonight, the topic we're talking about is substances that are controversial. We just had 420 as a somewhat of a holiday here in Boulder for certain people. And so we wanted to bring in at least three topics to provide us with plenty of content for this conversation, right? The three topics were tobacco, alcohol, and marijuana. My title for tonight was Tobacco, Alcohol, and Marijuana, Oh My. I think you thought of something else, right?
Yeah, I wanted to go with ATF,
but
I wanted firearms in there as well, but maybe that's another one for another day.
Yeah, that gets into self-defense and pacifism. I don't think we can cover all of that tonight.
Yeah.
So tonight...
Can I have one other thing that we're going to do?
For sure.
I'll also be giving you draft updates as it goes on. I've got the draft going live because we are competing with the NFL draft right now, and the Broncos are on the clock.
Please let me know.
I will. Okay, go ahead.
That's great. And before we get into tonight, something I always like to do is share kind of background where I come from on this issue, just so that you can know that we're just trying to be who we are, where we are in process. We're relatively young pastors, and we always want to grow in this stuff. And wherever we land on these issues, and we come from different backgrounds. And so my background on tobacco, alcohol, and marijuana is from a very conservative background where, you know, I definitely didn't drink before I was 21. I've never smoked the marijuana. You know, that was never my experience.
Yeah, that's how somebody who has never had marijuana would say it, the marijuana. Do you do drugs?
That's right.
That means you never did drugs.
And so I came from more of a straight-laced background, and I think Matt's story is a little bit different. This is actually one of the great things I love about The Well, is that we're great friends, and we get to do ministry together, and we come from very different backgrounds. And so why don't you tell a little bit about your story?
Yeah. I mean, for those of you who are just meeting me, I believe it or not, I am a pastor. My journey to becoming a pastor was not a typical one in many respects. And, my family always jokes that they never saw this coming, and neither did I. I grew up around bars. That was a lot of my life, and not even in a negative. I don't mean that in a negative necessarily. My mom was a bartender for a long time, worked in restaurants, did all that stuff. My father's a musician, still is, and as a kid, I was like a roadie with him sometimes, and learned my way around bars. And then just the culture I lived in, I wasn't in a church culture really or anything, and I was around marijuana, used marijuana. Sophia, my oldest daughter, if you're watching this, you need to go to bed. But yeah, so like, and it actually had a pretty big part in my story, and even to the point where I would say I abused those things. I was never a quote unquote druggie in the sense of like hard drugs. I was always scared of that kind of stuff. But I definitely used stuff and even became, I think, at times dependent, and thankful to God for that journey of being able to come out of that. And it gives me a unique perspective, I think, in going, what is good, what is bad. And I've even seen alcohol ruin people's lives. I have smoked in my life, not even marijuana, but regular cigarettes, you know, and all that stuff. And I've seen the ups and downs of all of that. And so
for sure,
hopefully I can provide some different insight.
For sure. And we all have different stories, right? Where we have relatives or people that have either explored these topics or struggled with these issues, or relatives that have died as alcoholics or lung cancer from tobacco use or anything like that. And really our hope tonight, I think, our goal tonight would be to at least provide some information biblically, theologically, from church history, where we can at least say, hey, these are some ideas we should at least be considering on these topics. What the hope actually isn't tonight is that we're going to answer all your questions. Although we want to answer your questions, you can send those in the comment section on whatever platform you're watching, and we're going to get those sent to us, and we're hopefully going to have the last half of this be interactive with you, answering questions, so we'll get to do that. But the goal actually isn't to necessarily have a new law, because I don't know if you know that, but pastors aren't people who write laws. We're not here to create new laws for people. Nope. We're just here to look at the scriptures, look at how God wants and how God wants us to live, and hopefully provide you with some wisdom on these issues.
The Broncos took Jerry Jeudy, wide receiver, Alabama.
Thanks for the update.
There you go.
So let's get into some different perspectives. What we'll do is we'll cover some biblical passages first, then some church history, and then maybe some missional perspectives on how this stuff goes. And so, I just wanted to highlight a few verses. I think I'll pick one first. I think in Proverbs 23:20, Proverbs is a great place to go to on these issues, because Proverbs is full of wisdom literature. We just walked through Proverbs as a church recently, and Proverbs is great because it's helping you kind of learn to grow up, learn to use things wisely, learn to be a wise person. And Proverbs 23:20 says this, if I can find it: "Be not among drunkards or among gluttonous eaters of meat, for the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty, and slumber will clothe them with rags." And so the author of Proverbs here is getting after kind of this idea. If you're someone who's just eating all the time, who's kind of slothful, who is all about drinking, who is all about that lifestyle of just getting drunk often, it's not going to go well for you. He's actually making a pragmatic argument, right? Yeah. Where it's not so much it is a moral argument, but that's what's great about Proverbs oftentimes, is God is showing us a pragmatic way to look at the consequences of our life.
Yeah, and I can't help but think when I hear you read that verse is how much culture loves to celebrate, particularly in men. I don't know why. I might be wrong in that, but at least how I perceive it, particularly men, that kind of like being able to pound as many beers as you can, and be drunk and have like a man cave where you like just lounge in it all the time, like is a good characteristic.
Sure.
And I don't know about you, but my wife, I don't think would be like, man, that's just so hot, babe.
No, I don't think so.
Like that's like, and it's just like, it's something that gets put out there as a lifestyle, and obviously the Bible says otherwise.
For sure.
Yeah.
Something kind of on the other, if there was another perspective, I want to turn to 1 Corinthians 6:12. This is where Paul is writing to the church at Corinth, and his letter to the Corinthian church is actually fascinating. We preached on that, I think a few years ago, right? And the church at Corinth is crazy. Like if you read 1 Corinthians, it is just insane. And so he's constantly reminding them of how they should be behaving. And so it says this, 1 Corinthians 6:12, Paul says, "All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be enslaved by anything." What are your thoughts when you hear that verse, Matt, on the topic of these substances and issues that we're facing?
Yeah, I think early on when I became a Christian, I interpreted that as I can do whatever the crap I want.
Really? Okay.
And then I actually learned how to read the Bible.
Sure. That's always a good thing.
I mean, that's the funny thing. Like, that's the beauty of the grace of God, right? Is like, I think of it in light of my story. When I read things like this early on, I didn't know how to interpret that right. And I was doing stuff way wrong. And the grace of God was still with me in that. Right, but now, as I've grown, obviously, and have gone to seminary and been a pastor for a long time now, It's one of those things of going like, hey, yeah, I can do a lot of things, but is it the best thing? Is it the wisest thing? Is it the best move? Is it beneficial for me? Is it beneficial for my relationship with God? Is it beneficial for those around me?
Sure.
And so it's actually freedom to not do as much as to do, right?
That's right, yeah.
Instead of just going, well, I'm free to do whatever I want because I'm in God,
For sure.
It's like, I think freedom actually naturally has to come with a certain level of internal restraint.
Right.
Because if you don't have any restraint, then I don't think you have real freedom.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what Paul's getting at there.
Yeah, and really he talks often about that idea that we're constrained by love, that we should be looking out for people who, elsewhere he talks about the weaker brother, right?
Yep.
That we should be concerned with how they deal with these issues. We should be concerned with, in that instance, he's talking about meat, food sacrificed to idols, right? And so he's concerned for people whose consciences may be a little bit more sensitive to that. And so that's an important point as well. I think another passage that's really important to consider, let's go to John 2:1. This is one of my favorite ones. And really, we could spend the next 20 minutes talking about this passage. It's from the life of Jesus, his ministry. It's one of the first things he did. 2:1, we've got Jesus. He's invited to a wedding with his disciples. And they run out of wine. They have no wine. And so they go to Jesus.
Travesty.
Yeah, right? At a wedding?
wedding?
Yeah, I know. And so
cash bar only at that point.
they go to Jesus and they're like, do whatever this man says. And Jesus tells them to fill up the jars with water and then draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. And when the master of the feast tasted it, it had become wine. And really, the guy that tasted the wine, he said, this is even better than the other wine, which at a party, what they would have been doing, I don't know about a party now, but at a party then, they would have been serving cheaper stuff towards the end, right?
Yep.
And so he's reflecting on, look, they've kept the best for last, and Jesus turns this water into wine. When you hear that story, what do you think about?
Honestly?
Yeah.
I thought of Talladega Nights and Ricky Bobby that he likes his Jesus to party. But in a more serious level, I think there's something beautiful there that there. I think right now, particularly in the midst of this whole coronavirus thing, how much would you love to be at a party with good friends right now, a wedding? Like the reception,
right?
And just seeing people together and that enjoyment of that, and I think Jesus wanted the night to continue, and wanted the celebration. I think we get too focused on what's being consumed at the party there, right? Yeah. That does matter, but I think there's something deeper there. That having a good time is a Christian attitude.
For sure.
That having a great party is a Christian behavior.
For sure.
And yeah.
And there's also theological kind of like implications for the use of wine in this instance, because in the Jewish tradition, wine was kind of the blessing of God, that God was going to provide for them in Passover. When Jewish people celebrate Passover, they use wine. And so for him to use wine as a signifier that, hey, I'm gonna have a ministry marked by celebration. The kingdom is here, and the kingdom is going to be instituted in a way that maybe is a little different than what you expected. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, but wasn't it grape juice, Chase?
No, yes. This is something that a lot of people actually struggle with, is when we look at the Bible, when we look at biblical words like sehar for the Hebrew word for strong drink, there's often some confusion about what these substances were. And there's good Christians on both sides of the argument here, but some Christians are convinced that it wasn't truly wine. And when we look at the archaeological evidence, we know that it's wine. We can see that it's wine. It's definitely wine. In fact, the strong drink would have been made from anything from dates to other fruits they had that are fermented and turned into alcohol. And I know I've been part of brewing beer before, and it can be very hard to really set out the ABV, the alcohol content of something, even in a controlled environment we have now today, knowing the science. So I can't imagine how varied some of those date drinks would have been back in the day.
I don't think
that would have gone well, right? This is actually something that comes up in Leviticus 10:9, if we want to go to the Old Testament.
That's a good one.
And we'll spend there's a couple verses.
You all love Leviticus, don't you? You've been reading that with your family in your devotional?
That's right.
Since you've been locked at home?
Leviticus 10:9.
Let's have some fun on Leviticus.
And the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, drink no wine or strong drink, you or your sons with you, when you go into the tent of meeting, lest you die. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations. You are to distinguish between the holy and the common, between the unclean and the clean, and you are to teach the people of Israel all the statutes that the Lord has spoken to them by Moses. And so this is a specific instance with Aaron and his sons, the priest of the nation. And when they should go before the Lord, they're not supposed to have any strong drink before going to the Lord in that instance, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a very interesting prohibition that God gives his people very clearly, right?
Yeah, so don't drink before church.
Yeah, that would
So
be...
all you at home having mimosas on Sunday, watching church online, Leviticus 10.
Leviticus,
Don't do that.
That's right. Now, if we hop over in Deuteronomy 14, this was I ran this passage, or kind of this outline that we're going to have tonight by one of my friends who grew up independent Baptist, and he wanted to make sure this was a passage that was brought up because it's been something that's been a passage that he's wrestled with. Deuteronomy 14, 24 to 26. This says this, and if the way is too long for you, this is God talking to his people, so that you are not able to carry the tithe when the Lord your God blesses you, because the place is too far from you, which the Lord your God chooses. So all throughout that verse we see God choosing, God blessing, to set his name there. Then you shall turn it into money and bind up the money in your hand and go to the place the Lord God chooses and spend the money for whatever you desire, oxen or sheep or wine or strong drink, whatever your appetite craves. And you shall eat there before the Lord your God and rejoice, you and your household. That's an interesting command. And I've read this passage before, but before I really examined it today, I just find it really curious that God would command his people to take their money and spend it almost like, hey, spend it on whatever you want at this point, right?
What would you say to the person? I'm imagining all of the, this is contextual.
Sure.
Right, like that's not meant. That was for specific people at a specific time.
For sure,
that's not necessarily for us. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think that even though there are contextual implications in interpreting the verse, right?
Yeah.
That as we look at this verse and it's written to a certain people, that we see the heart of God blessing his people, choosing a place for them, and then showing them a principle they can live with their money. That money to be used on these things isn't necessarily wrong. And I say necessarily very intentionally because it can be used in a bad way, right? Of course, if you're an alcoholic and you're buying alcohol and that's what you're using your money for, then of course. But there is a principle, and this almost gets into a different topic entirely of money. How are we to use our money? And what God is saying sometimes with our money is you can use it wisely within my bounds, and you can use it for things that you want and that you desire, which is a very interesting perspective and curious to see about God's attitude about this stuff. Are there any verses that we have here that you want me to check out?
No, I mean, that one was the one that I really wanted to get into.
I think Ephesians 5:18 is important. This one where it talks about being filled with the Spirit. I want to make sure we highlight that. This one comes up often.
Yeah.
If I can find a few.
Because it means when you're filled with the Spirit, you act like a drunk person, right?
Something like that.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
Ephesians 5:18 says, "And do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit." And then he goes on to tell us how we should be addressing one another. And so there's this contrast that Paul is writing here to the church at Ephesus saying, hey, we don't want to be people who are drunk on wine. Instead, we want to be filled with the Spirit. When you hear that, how do you understand that verse?
Yeah, I think there's an important thing here. I think one is, I don't think there's any, I think that verse is a kind of cornerstone verse for the argument that it's okay to get drunk.
Oh, really?
I don't think it is.
Right,
it's just not. You know what I mean? We can go elsewhere, but when I go there, I think what we're called to is presence with God over presence with substance.
Sure.
And I think that's going to be a big theme of what we're talking about here tonight, right?
For sure.
And for some people, as I think about this stuff, I can't help but, if you're at home and maybe you've struggled with alcoholism or you're sober, I want to celebrate that. And so don't hear me, we're trying to have a loose attitude up here and play. And so there's definitely a reality where drunkenness for some can just lead to a very dangerous path. And I'm really thankful that people that are in our church that have been able to kick that addiction and are sober, and I want to celebrate those people because I think they're leaning into, hey, I need to be more present with God than I need to be present with the substance, because it is driving a wedge between me and my Creator, which is not what anybody should want or desire, but does happen all too often.
For sure. And that kind of gets us to kind of a concluding principle, because these are just some of the passages, and there's if you did a Bible search for alcohol or things like that of being controlled by something, there'd be a lot more. And really, we'd love to hear from you in the Q&A if you've got other verses that really are either kind of sounding bells for you that you kind of rest your convictions on this topic of. I want to hear those verses. I want to hear kind of your take on it so we can talk about those verses. But really the principle we're seeing in these verses is, hey, we don't want to be mastered and controlled by things like this.
Yeah.
We don't want to be drunk. Now that's an interesting topic, and this is, unfortunately, I hope this comes across in live stream and not just, not being in person. There's kind of a loss. But it gets into the question of what is drunkenness, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because that's a huge issue is, I've heard the argument made that anything that affects your mental state of being would be something you're controlled by.
Yeah.
Well, if that was the case, I couldn't have a cheeseburger. I'm very controlled when I have a cheeseburger. I'm excited.
Wow, you really like cheeseburgers.
I love cheeseburgers. So that would be something that I'm controlled by, and so I couldn't have that anymore.
Yeah.
And so we should really consider when the Bible says don't be drunk.
Yeah.
And if you had a Christian come to you up on a Sunday and be like, I don't know what this means, how would you explain that to them?
Yeah, I think that I'm always weary of the hard, fast line on something.
Sure.
Because I think we want that, right? It just would be easier.
Sure.
2 beers.
Right.
And then you
That's
can't
it.
drink anymore.
Yeah, right.
That'd be convenient, but that's not reality.
For sure.
Right? Or a glass of wine every night's fine. And the doctors even say it's good for my heart health. Right?
Sure.
I don't know if that's true or not, so don't quote me.
He's not a doctor.
I am not a doctor. I don't even have a master's degree yet. Yeah, I'm not quick to draw a line on it.
Sure.
But I think we have to be reasonable people.
Right.
When it comes to these kinds of things. Here's the thing. If you know me, I know you. If I showed up at your house and I was drunk, you would know it.
Right, yeah.
Right?
Sure.
If I was I had a beer
Right.
today, you probably would have no idea.
Sure.
I think there are things where we can go, hey, that person's losing control.
Right.
At a point.
Yeah, I wonder if there was a Supreme Court argument made a while ago on a different topic, the issue of pornography, and they were trying to decide if they should prohibit it in different instances. And the justice in that case said, I know it when I see it. That's how we define pornography, because that is a different topic that we probably should get into in a Theology on Tap. But in a similar way, the argument you're making is you're going to know it when you see it. When somebody's drunk, it's pretty obvious to everybody. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so, because it's different from people. I'll give you an example. I've only been there with just my wife and I one time, but there's a great restaurant in Boulder called Frosco. We were celebrating a huge event in our life, and we went there for dinner, and it's also known for its great wine program.
Sure.
Right? And the Psalm came over and walked us through the wine, and we drank a bottle of wine while we sat there over a few hours of this massive dinner that was beautiful and wonderful. And I can honestly say that was a worshipful experience with my wife and I. And some people might go, a bottle of wine's way too much in a night. And I'm like, that might be true at times.
Right.
In that scenario, it felt just fine.
For sure.
And so I don't know where to draw that line, but I think you do know. I think you're right with that.
And I think it does get into a lot of wisdom issue. That doesn't, and don't hear us when we say wisdom, that's license. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about living in authentic community with other people, being honest with where your affections are, where your heart is, and what you're either worshiping or enslaved to. And so just generally the principle is we don't want to be controlled by things to a point where we're dependent on it to live, where we have to go to it, where it is our identity, where it defines us. But I think that's an important principle. So far we've talked about, and there's a reason for this, we've only talked about alcohol, right?
Yeah.
And we've still got 2 other topics. Part of the reason we aren't necessarily talking about those topics yet is because the Bible, I don't know if you found that verse yet, but does the Bible talk about those things?
It does not talk about the reefer.
It does not talk about the marijuana. And so, what we're trying to do is we're trying to build a biblical understanding of how God expects us to live with a substance that can be abused, like alcohol, in order to then inform our understanding of something like tobacco or marijuana.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to kind of summarize before? I was going to go into church history next, but is there anything else you want to talk about?
No, church history sounds riveting.
Church history is great.
I know.
It's awesome.
I've learned to love it.
Church history is awesome because what we get, and I think a lot of Christians do themselves a disservice if you haven't picked up Bruce Shelley's Church History in Plain Language, a book like that's pretty accessible. You get 2,000 years of history of people interpreting the Bible, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of us act like we get this book and you're the only person that's ever read it, and the only way to understand it is just you alone in a closet studying this Bible, and we just miss out on so many lessons from church history, on ways that we should and shouldn't read the Bible, right? And so one of the things I always like to bring up, I read this book last year, and it was recommended to me by another pastor, Brian Brown, and it was on Calvin and the Reformation. It was a great study on how Calvin interacted with other pastors, how he formed his own little network in Geneva, and how they all pastored the local congregations. And something stood out to me on this topic, and it's that they were compensated for their work, the pastors in Geneva, not just with money, but also with barrels of wine. Barrels of wine on a monthly basis. This wasn't like just one barrel a year. This was multiple barrels a month of wine.
Yeah.
And so I just thought that was an interesting reflection of, hey, Calvin didn't seem to have an issue with this.
Yeah.
Is that something you see when you've studied church history?
Yeah, I mean, first I would say I'd be down with a conversation like that. I don't think my wife would let that go. So no, I mean, like as I'm thinking through the most recent church history book I read was Rise of Christianity by Stark.
Sure.
And there's no real mention of that there, but you do see stories of drink predominantly being a part of the church, particularly with the table, communion, that process. Obviously, that's a little different in some respect, but it's present. But no, I've read that about that, but it's interesting, particularly with the reformers or people in the Reformed tradition like ours. You see that alcohol, then even like a little bit more modern, you see tobacco being used pretty regularly.
For sure.
By people that we hold up in high esteem.
Yeah, one of your favorite preachers, who is that?
Spurgeon.
Yeah, and so he was big on cigars, right?
Yeah.
Loved a good cigar. In fact, you can go to different websites and find pictures of him, like you can get a mug with him smoking a cigar, right?
Yeah, I may have owned one of those at one point.
That doesn't surprise me. There's definitely what you see in church history also is consequences for people in the church community that behave in a drunkardly fashion regularly. And so this isn't to say they were just enabling people to have alcohol. There were definitely boundaries on that. But this is curious to me, and I didn't put this down in kind of our outline, is that the issue and the concern around alcohol as a use, right, as a thing that you can use wisely. You don't have to at all, but you can use wisely. Really, the rise of pietism as a kind of theological German pietism from the 1700s, 1800s, and then all of a sudden it kind of spilled over into American culture with the fundamentalist schism, right, in the early 1900s. And you had this prohibition movement. And really that's when people come to our church at least once a month and they're asking, what's our stance on alcohol?
Or marijuana.
Or anything like that. And before the rise of pietism and all that stuff, you don't see those questions getting brought up in church history.
Yeah, that's why you don't read much about it.
Yeah,
like, it's not really there.
It's strange.
As a debatable thing that was really going on.
Right. Another person you might have heard is C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien wrote some great works, right?
Yeah. And
they got to do that. Do you remember the name of the pub?
I don't.
I'm sure someone in the comments can let us know. But they would get together often, and they would have kind of, I think it was called the Inklings, and they would get together, and they would kind of have these writing workshops where they would share pints of beer in an English pub. You can go visit it today. And they would get inspired for their work together, and they would collaborate on Lord of the Rings or whatever books they were writing at the time. And so someone like C.S. Lewis, who most Christians hold in high regard, was someone who regularly used beer as a wise thing to consume, right?
Well, even like the rhythm of hymns that we had written during that time period came from pub songs.
That's right.
As like a missional move.
That's right.
So that people were more comfortable with singing it. So they're actually bringing a bit of the pub.
That's a great point.
Into the church.
For sure.
And that wasn't frowned upon.
Right.
You know,
it was a way to reach the common person who would be singing in these melodies anyways, instead of singing Ave Maria or something like that, which they probably still did, but they adapted their stylings, right?
Yeah. Does that mean we should start doing karaoke at the well since that's popular now?
I don't think so. I don't think that's popular. No, that's not a thing. That actually takes us into kind of our last and final point before we do a kind of a Q&A. Is really the cultural and missional perspectives on the issues of alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana. You'll see some young guys, and I was probably like this, may still be like this, I don't know, who once they kind of leave home, right, if they're brought up in a conservative upbringing and they study this stuff, they can kind of go all in on, well, I can use whatever kind of tobacco I want, I can drink whatever I want, and we can justify that from almost a missional perspective. Well, this way I can go drink with my coworkers. This way I can go smoke a cigarette with somebody. And so you get some of those perspectives. In Boulder, we've even had a Church of Marijuana, right? We've had...
Yeah, that guy sits outside of Ozo and hands out his cards for the Church of Marijuana all the time.
That's right. And so you can have a Church of Marijuana, and then you'll get...
You really can't.
Well, yeah, no.
It's not a real church.
It's depending on how you define a church, right?
Yeah, but how we would define a church.
Not how we would define a church. And then you get some people who believe that Christians shouldn't drink. In fact, they could argue from a missional perspective as well. They could say that because Christians are to be set apart from the world, and they're supposed to be kind of this other kingdom, this city on a hill, that we shouldn't consume. In fact, consuming those things makes us like the world. It makes us worldly. Yeah. And so you kind of get these two perspectives.
Yeah. Well, one thing I do want to say in that regard is I think a lot of times the more conservative side who is anti-drinking and stuff can feel like, particularly from guys like you and I, who clearly aren't opposed to it all.
Sure.
You know?
Yeah.
We want restraint, right? Like we've been talking about. But I don't want those people thinking because we disagree with them that we don't want to honor them.
Right.
And I see the good and the benefit in what they're doing, and I'm sure they're doing many things better than we are.
Right.
In that respect. And so I think there's room for, and I hope there's room for
sure.
Christian brothers and sisters to be able to have some disagreement in there.
Yep.
And it'd be a good thing. I think it's something that is deeply needed actually within the church, just within the world, is the ability to disagree.
Totally.
And still go, man, but those are good people who I love.
Totally.
But I'm not going to have a beer with them.
Yeah, and that's the whole point of Theology on Tap, really, is to show, like, hey, like, we can disagree on these issues and still be friends, and we can still be part of the same church. There are people who go to our church who would land in different places on these issues than us. One of the issues with marijuana, and because I've never used marijuana, right, I don't have experience with it. One of the things that I've heard kind of come up in ministry is like some people view it as a missional opportunity, that if they go smoke a joint with their neighbor or their roommate or somebody, that somehow that's going to open a door to them to connect with them better, to share the gospel with them. What do you think about that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I get it. I disagree.
Sure.
My neighbors might be watching this. I saw one of them logged on. Johnny, if you're watching, what's up? But I've got some really great neighbors who smoke regularly.
Sure.
And I love hanging out with them. They're my neighbors. I want to be missional to them. I want to share Jesus with them. And I want to be more than just a sharer of Jesus with them. I want to be an encouragement to them and show them the gospel.
Right.
And I've hung out with these people for years now. And I don't think they've ever been like, because I've never smoked pot with them.
Sure.
Okay. They've offered it to me. They still do. It's funny. Like after years, every time it's like, no, I'm good. And I'm still good. Right. But, you know, I don't feel like when I'm there, they're like, this dude, so lame.
Sure.
Typical Christian.
Right.
Won't smoke weed with me.
Sure.
I hate this guy. I haven't had that experience. Maybe somebody else has. I don't want to, but I've been able to be missional.
Right.
In that context without getting high with somebody.
For sure.
You know, I get where they're coming from. I'd also maybe say, maybe you just want to get high.
Right.
And you might be looking for an excuse.
Sure.
That might be it.
Might be, yeah.
I don't know that person or what's on their mind, but I think you can navigate that in a nuanced way that still allows you to be missional and friendly.
For sure.
Without smoking pot.
Yeah, that's a great point. And this actually brings up kind of the issue to a head is, you know, as pastors, we want to be people who kind of model what we read biblical character be. We don't get that right all the time. By any means, we want to be repentant people, definitely. But you mentioned something in there that for you, you've said, hey, I'm not going to participate.
Correct.
So based on the biblical evidence, based on kind of the church history, that kind of thing, what's kind of led you to make that conclusion for you?
I think for me, what I saw was what it was doing to my friends.
Okay.
And I don't want to, like, I feel like such a nerd when I go like, it's a gateway drug, but it kind of was.
Was that growing up? Like,
yeah, but that kind of was for a lot of my friends got into some pretty serious stuff.
Sure.
And we all started with the same thing.
Sure.
And some of us were like, nope, that's too far. Some of us didn't, but none of us like were doing meth the first time we tried something.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
Like that was like, I never did meth, just for the record. Like, anything made in a bathtub was no go for me.
That was your limit.
Yeah, that was my limit. Everybody's got to have them.
Yeah, that's right.
But yeah, like I saw what it did relationally,
Sure.
personally. It led people down a road, and it also just, I mean, like, honestly, I hear people like, it's like wine, or you can have this, you can have that. I never met anybody who was like smoking pot to not get high,
Sure. Right.
like really high.
Right.
As high as you could. Like the goal was always to find the best weed you could find.
Okay.
To get as high as you could possibly get.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And it seems very, in my usage, it seems like a hard thing to control.
Right.
I get it. There's a lot of new stuff out there.
Right.
And maybe I'm totally uneducated in that, and I'm willing to be wrong there
Right.
on how you can control that.
Right.
But I think there are some medicinal values. I think there's things in there that it has to come from a doctor.
Right.
Oversight, things like that
Right.
that I could be down for. I remember, I don't know if you remember this. We had a guy at our church for a while. He was just here for some medical treatment.
Yep, I remember
He was
that.
here. He worked for NASA. He had a serious degenerative eye disease.
Right.
And the only thing that was helping him was a medical marijuana usage.
Right.
And his wife was sitting there in tears talking to me about how she had her husband back because of this drug in more ways than she'd ever had.
Right.
That was an eye opener for me. I was very like, no, just across the board until I had that experience.
For sure.
So I'm willing to learn
Yeah.
and grow.
Yeah.
But that's just kind of where I've landed on that.
And so that actually brings up a good paradigm. Tim Keller talks about this paradigm of receive, redeem, reject, right?
Yeah.
And I think at the well, at least what I've taught in membership, and I think what you've taught as well, is that marijuana can be something that we can redeem in some cases, right? That there's medicinal qualities for either sleep or for seizures or for other things like
Pain.
that. Yeah, pain. But there should be some kind of intentionality with a doctor talking with a professional on the use, because from what I understand, the marijuana you can get today is a little bit stronger.
Yeah, dude, that stuff will send you to Pluto. Like, it looks like you're buying Christmas trees. It's crazy.
I'll take your word for
Yeah.
it. Not that I understand.
I've seen. I live in Boulder.
That's right.
Relax in the comments
That's
section.
right.
Relax.
I think one of the last things, and then we'll do some Q&A, is, this kind of brings up another issue. The Reformers had this great history in kind of the monks and monasteries of brewing beer. You'll get Trappist beers in Europe. And so there's actually kind of this weird pairing between church history, and there's a pairing with education, that churches started Harvard and other higher education institutes, but also breweries, right?
Yep.
And so it gets this interesting pairing throughout church history. But you found yourself in an interesting opportunity with some other people at our church that wanted to start a hangout in town called the Rayback, right?
Yep.
And so what was it like for you as you wrestled with being part of that experience, being part of that journey with those people that are still doing great work? What did it feel like for you as a pastor to go like, hey, like I'm going to be part of something that's kind of like, it's essentially a bar. You've got a bunch of beer on tap.
Yeah, it is
right?
a bar. There's no way around it.
So it's essentially a bar. What is that tension like for you?
Yeah. One, I will say this. It's great missionally in Boulder.
Sure.
People go, what do you do? I go, I'm a pastor. And they go, oh, cool. And I own bars.
Sure.
And they're like, what? Like, it just kind of blows up their paradigm of what they expected.
Right.
And you've heard me say it a million times. I've got
I
my
have.
joke. I say,
Yes.
pastors have been in the beer and wine industry a lot longer than hipsters.
right.
And so I always joke with people. But in all seriousness, it was something that my wife and I talked about. I talked about with the partners there
Right.
that were also believers, and we made a conscious decision. I think locations will set a certain ethos. Right?
Sure.
And how you train your staff and how you do stuff like that. You can create a more community spot where it's like the goal there isn't to overserve people and get people drunk. What are you serving?
Right.
Like, are you serving like a giant drink that comes out of a boot that's like just loaded with half
Right.
a bottle of vodka?
Right.
The goal there is to get people drunk. Are you serving craft beers or good cocktails or good wine that people don't want to just slam back?
For sure.
Right. And so that helped me out, going like, hey, I want to create an environment where it has that, but also having good quality drinks for people who didn't drink, like kombucha.
Right.
Something different where people could go out and not just have a Coke.
For sure.
Right. And so kind of mixing those two worlds and making it a community place together, I think was helpful for me. Some people, I've had some people get mad at me who are Christians over it. And I get it.
Sure.
Like I'm apologetic to them. I don't agree with them.
Sure.
The missional benefit of doing it has been substantial for me as a person, and I also believe for our church. I know that there's plenty of you out there have told me actually that it has been a selling point that I was involved in that industry when you try to invite somebody to church, because people have a perception of who guys like Chase and I are.
Right.
I mean, we are kind of nerds.
We are.
But we can be it's cool to be a nerd now. So
Yeah, right. Yeah,
so
for sure.
yeah, does that answer that question?
I think so, yeah.
I don't want to sound too political.
No, I think that's sufficient, and people are welcome to ask.
Yeah.
And really, I think that kind of brings us to some concluding remarks on kind of this topic, is that, one of the things you mentioned is that not only is the opportunity for us to be missional with people in Boulder, around the world, but also we have to think about, as Christians, we're called to create and cultivate the kingdom to come now. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I've always kind of wrestled with when I think about the topic of particularly marijuana is, what kind of society are we creating if we're just creating, and I think particularly because I'm a guy, if we're just creating a bunch of guys who are sitting around getting high all the time, right? That doesn't seem like that's by no means necessarily a knock on people in general that consume marijuana. It's just saying, as a society, what kind of society would it look like? Is it going to be a beautiful society that reflects the kingdom of God or not?
Yeah, I think of it this way. I think of my sons and my son and my daughters.
Sure.
How do I want them to be living?
Sure.
It's easy, because you want them to be better than you.
Yeah.
And I would be more proud of my son if he had like a library instead of a man cave.
Sure.
Right? Or
Yeah.
I'd be more proud if he was like, no, studying and learning and knowing God more is more important than getting wasted.
Right.
That'd be an honorable thing.
For sure.
That I'd be proud of in him or my daughters.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. There's a great article that Jen Oshman dropped this week, actually, on 420. Maggie has access to it, and so she's going to drop it in the comment section. But she went into so much great work on the topic, particularly of marijuana, and really, what should a Christian biblical perspective be on the topic of marijuana? And so I just want to point you to that resource, because we didn't get to cover near enough. And hopefully, as you kind of listen to us, I'm sure there's probably stuff you disagree with. That's totally fine. We want to hear from you. We want to interact. We want to help. There's probably areas where we're wrong on this, and we definitely don't pretend to know everything up here. We just wanted to share some thoughts with you on this. I think my concluding remark before we jump into some questions we got coming this way is that, smoking marijuana recreationally, if the intention behind that, which generally is, I think we've covered, is to escape the world, to kind of numb yourself, which during the season of a global pandemic is super tempting.
Right.
Where you just kind of either want to get drunk or high to escape this crazy anxiety that we're feeling right now. Mm-hmm. It's not a wise decision to make. It's not a biblically wise. In fact, there's almost some biblical prohibitions against that. And really getting high is almost equated with drunkenness, at least when we talk about kind of the biblical principles. But that's kind of, when I kind of tie all these things together, we never want to give ourselves into something that can totally enslave us in a way that would dishonor Christ and be unwise, right?
Yeah.
Anything else you would add to that?
No, that sounds way better than anything I would have said to close.
Neat. That's great. Well, let's get into some questions we've got coming. We've got someone new, the name of the C.S. Lewis pub. It's the Eagle and Child Pub.
It's a strange name.
Yeah, that is.
I wouldn't
Those British
recommend
people, they've got lots of toad pubs and all this kind of stuff. So
Eagle and Child, it's like an eagle swooped down and stole a child, and
I'd
something
go.
creepy like that.
What about this next question, Matt? You want to take that one?
Yeah. So the question is there a certain amount of pot you can smoke that makes it okay, like there is a certain amount of alcohol you can drink where you can stop before you get drunk?
That's a great question, because that comes up all the time when we're talking about this issue with people and trying to help them.
And the answer to that now is probably yes.
Probably yes. What?
You can.
You can. Okay.
From what I know, I'm not a professional on it anymore, but like I know that there are things there. Mm-hmm. So again, to me that goes back to mainly for me. I would recommend, if you are going to use marijuana, that it's for a purpose that's been approved by a doctor.
Right.
For a purpose.
Sure.
Because it just seems like it would be so easy.
Sure.
right, to misstep. And again, maybe I'm wrong there, but I believe from what I've researched this week and in previous times before, like I remember when the whole entire election thing around should we legalize marijuana came for recreational use. I dove deep into that.
Sure.
And I definitely saw like a lot of the argument there was that now like they can control. But most of the stuff that I think is being sold or pushed
Right.
isn't like,
Sure.
hey, it's the equivalent of having a glass of wine.
Right. Yeah, I don't think so either.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I would even push back even a little bit on that, and we may disagree on this, is that, when you are indulging in smoking pot, you're giving into almost kind of a culture, and that's what Jen Oshman actually really hits on in her article, is that it's almost an alternative vision of an alternative kingdom that you're living into. Yeah. When that's kind of a lifestyle choice for you, that's what you're going to consume, you're all of a sudden starting to get into a whole new culture that could be the antithesis of the kingdom. I'm not saying it is. That's an interesting thing to explore.
Yeah. I think I was just trying to answer it more bluntly, like, can you?
Sure. No.
And I'm going,
that's fair.
I think so.
Yeah.
And that's a great answer from me. I don't know. So, yeah.
We've got another question coming in.
From Marty Combs.
That's right. How do you distinguish between liquor and weed?
Well, one's liquid.
Marty would understand your sense of humor. So how would we distinguish between liquor and weed? Well, with liquor, there's all sorts of variations in liquor. What kind of liquor is it? All that kind of stuff, right? With liquor, you've got certain pours and drinks and all that kind of stuff you can consume. It's very measured. It's measured in how much alcohol per volume, all that kind of stuff. And so I think I would just distinguish between the strength of the substance consumed and the ability to self-regulate wisely on that substance.
For sure, yeah. I don't know why it came to me, but I think it also matters too with all of this stuff. I don't just, when my brain, things happen in there sometimes. But where, hey, whether it's liquor or beer or, we haven't even really talked about tobacco.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think a lot of it does, like one point we should absolutely make is that there is a line where if it would be like, if you have a friend or somebody who does struggle with it, don't drink in front of them.
For sure.
Like that's going back to that freedom passage.
Yeah, and that's what we've actually recommended to groups at our church. Yeah. Because we've tried to struggle with this. Hopefully we've struggled well, but we've definitely misstepped a couple times. And leading our church is like our groups. What does group life look like when you have somebody that's struggling with alcohol, and should you consume alcohol around that person? And we try to encourage our group leaders to be mindful of that when they have people in their home, right?
Yeah, I would just encourage you this. When you have people come into your home, don't just assume that everybody's okay with what you're okay with. Just ask them. And I think that actually honors somebody oftentimes who is sober or is in that process, to know that it's a safe place to find that out. So
for sure.
This other question we got here is, what's your opinion on Proverbs 31, 4-7? Since you have that memorized, Chase.
Yes, memorized. Proverbs 31, 4-7 says this: "It is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, or for rulers to take strong drink, lest they drink and forget what has been decreed, and pervert the rights of all the afflicted. Give strong drink to the one who is perishing, and wine to those in bitter distress." 3:7, right?
Yeah.
"Let them drink and forget their poverty, and remember their misery no more." Yeah, it's an interesting passage for sure because, coming from wisdom literature, obviously this is the closing chapter of whether it's Solomon or someone else writing Proverbs at this time. He's coming from a place of wisdom, and he's trying to recommend to those in power, hey, like, you should be mindful of how you consume these things. And the interesting thing, I think, has always been in 31:6, "Give strong drink to the one who's perishing, and wine to those in bitter distress." God is deeply concerned with comforting the afflicted. Ultimately, we find comfort in the gospel, right, for our afflictions, the affliction of sin. But even in our distress, we can find comfort in the material world, even from something like wine or strong drink. But it is an interesting wisdom issue. When you hear that, what comes to mind?
I think it's a hilarious passage.
Why?
I just think it's like, I don't know how you go like the Bible. Those are the ones you kind of go to, and somebody's like, if you drink, it's evil. I'm like,
sure.
Well, I don't know. There are situations. I also see that our God isn't always, it's not always linear like we want it to be. There's situations that call for different things at different times.
Sure.
right? And that's why it does come down to a wisdom issue, right?
Yeah.
Is this wise or is this not?
Right.
And like the fascinating thing about wisdom too, we just got done teaching Proverbs, like you already said, is that like our wisdom isn't perfect.
Right.
And I think that's one of the dangers that I see Christians putting on each other, and why they go with that more pietistic position oftentimes is because they don't want to be wrong. They just go into no
Right. Yeah.
is the answer.
Sure.
And I think there's a lot of missed life to live in if that's the posture. So I think these kinds of passages can help us with that, to go, it's not always black and white, and you might get it right, you might get it wrong. No, there's grace for that. But if it is wrong, admit the wrong.
Right, yeah.
Confess the sin, repent of it.
Sure.
And move on.
Yeah. We've got another question coming in. How should I respond in a biblical way to my friends who say that it's okay to smoke pot since it's legal in Colorado? I love this question because it was a real cause of concern a few years ago, right? And it still is, obviously, for many people. How would you answer that question?
No.
Of course. The blunt answer.
Yeah. Just because it's permissible doesn't mean it's good.
Sure, yeah. And basically, as Christians, we're not looking to society at large to set the moral standard for our life, right? We're looking for this to inform our lives with wisdom and truth, and for God to tell us how to live. And so just because something's legal doesn't mean it's either, one, good, right?
Yeah.
Or two, permissible for Christians.
Yeah, like a good example of that would be pornography is legal.
Sure.
Do I believe it to be good? No.
No, right.
Should, like, somebody's like, I need this. No.
Right.
Like that's not true. So just like to your point, just because something's legal doesn't necessarily mean that it's something that we should do.
Right. And I remember this question being really, really prominent when we were leading through this time. I think it's been 2 or 3 years. It feels like the pandemic has already been 4 years.
I know, right?
But it was like a few years ago when pot became legal. And that was honestly, if we're honest with ourselves as pastors, we were able to go, well, it's illegal. So we didn't have to really dive into this stuff
so
as
great.
much. It was so easy to answer this. Well, you can't do it. It's illegal. And it actually, there was one redeeming thing. It made us study our Bible better, right? It made us know the Word of God better so that we can equip people better.
I think what's fascinating is right after it became legal, I remember we were sitting with a small group in our church. It was a guys group, and it was meeting over at what's the apartment complex over by Target?
Here in Boulder?
Yeah, here in Boulder. I can't remember. It doesn't matter. But we're all sitting there in this like lobby area. And there was a new guy in our church who just moved here from the South. And I just was curious. And I said, who here smokes pot regularly? And everybody but me and the dude from the South raised their hands. And I was like, oh. It takes a lot to shock me. And they're like, well, it's legal now. And that was kind of
that was it.
That was across the thing.
Yeah.
And that dude who just moved here was like, dude, what is wrong with your church?
You're doing a bad job.
I know. And I was like, I didn't know.
Right,
like you don't get church surveys like, do you get high on Friday?
Yeah, right.
And order tons of pizza. We don't get those like in surveys, right? Like that doesn't happen. So I just thought it was interesting that when that happened, it like went crazy.
For sure. And that actually brings up something I didn't get to talk about. Maybe I mentioned it, but at the well, we try to have a posture of anyone is welcome, no matter where you are, no matter what you're struggling with. We want to share life with you and do life with you. And so when we talk about these issues, hopefully you're not hearing us setting up these kind of roadblocks to connection, these roadblocks where if you do these things, you cannot be our friends or be part of our church at all. That's not at all what we're saying. We're literally just saying, hey, these are some things that we deal with as pastors, that we try to help people deal with as pastors. You want to go to this next question?
Yeah. Where's the line of smoking cigars in social setting, aka is it okay to smoke cigars? I would say yes. I think even particularly cigars, because if you're inhaling cigars, good luck.
Yeah, right.
You're going to start singing like Lucinda Williams sooner than later.
That's right.
But yeah, man, I don't have a problem with cigars. I really don't. I smoke them myself.
Sure.
I'll admit that.
Right.
I don't really even have a problem with cigarettes, to be honest.
Sure.
I guess that leads to like vaping. I don't know enough about it.
Sure.
I think it looks stupid. So there's that.
There's that.
But anyways, yeah, I don't really have a problem with cigars.
Yeah, cigarettes and cigars are interesting because cigarettes have this kind of cultural stigma, and for some people, there's a history of lung cancer in the family, people dying from that, and so we want to be sensitive to that. But as far as smoking cigars, it's something that I don't enjoy as much, but I want to enjoy it because all the guys seem to enjoy it. And then I like to smoke a pipe. A good pipe is good.
Yeah, pipe's way too much work.
I know, for you, yeah.
All right, you want to read this next one?
Yeah, this next one says, how can we as a church body enjoy alcohol in community while also being sensitive to those who would stumble from our enjoyment? For example, recovering alcoholics.
Yeah.
That's a great question. It's something that I think we're consistently wrestling with as we try to walk wisely.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're going to do as you try to walk wisely. That's not to say you can't not struggle with this leadership question or issue, but to say that you're going to take 2 steps forward, maybe 1 step back, in trying to lovingly pastor people, to honor one another, to honor, whether you call them the weaker brother or not, to respect other people's struggles and journeys and where they are. But it really is an important question. What's something that comes to mind when you think about this?
Yeah, I think this is a two-way street to a certain point. I would say this is that if you are that person that is recovering, that might be. I get that there's shame that can be wrapped up in that, and I want to be sensitive to that. But if you're able,
right,
and you're confident in it, letting people know is super helpful.
For sure.
Right. On the other side, I think it's, if you're going to drink, I said this before, I think you have a responsibility as a Christian, particularly if it's in your home.
Sure.
So if it's in my home, like our rule is, if there's somebody new that I don't know, I'm just going to pull them aside. And don't do it in front of everybody. Don't be at the dinner table and be like,
are you okay
hey,
with
I
this?
got some wine, but Steve's new.
Oh my God.
Steve, are you a recovering alcoholic? Bad move. Don't do that.
That would
like,
be bad.
You're a jerk if you do that, right?
Right.
But like, no, like when they come in, take their coat, whatever, be like, hey, I got a bottle of wine for tonight. Does that bother you at all? I want to be sensitive to that.
Sure.
I think that's a way you can honor and bless a guest in your home,
right,
and somebody with that. So if it's social, I think that if you're going to a bar,
right,
that's different, than in a home,
for sure,
than in a church function at like a barbecue.
Sure.
Right? Like each one is going to take nuance.
Yeah, like we struggled with this because we have, because we don't have a building yet.
Yeah.
We have to find events to host. We have to find spaces to host events at. And so typically Theology on Tap is at a local brewery. And so we have Theology on Tap and we have beer and it's a good time. We also do like our anniversary party. The places that have the most space in Boulder, in the Boulder County area, are breweries that we can rent for an affordable rate, right?
Yep.
And so we did our anniversary party at a brewery. And so that is a concern of ours when we do that. We had those conversations. We were planning the event. It's like, hey, like, how do we honor people?
It makes me sad when sometimes we have to do an event in a place where I know some people can't come.
Yeah.
Like I get that, and that's not lost on us.
Sure.
And so I think trying to be as sensitive, and anybody I know who's in recovery, gone through recovery, I think generally what I've heard from them, and you let us know if I'm wrong on this. I want to be a learner here on this topic, but is the attempt means a lot, right?
Sure.
To honor them in that and ask good questions.
For sure.
And try to do what you can. So, yeah.
This next question we've got says, how do I respond to my friends who say, and I've never heard this from one of my friends, but, doesn't mean it's not been said, weed makes me feel closer to God. I don't know if we're going to get serious, Matt, or sarcastic, Matt.
I don't know. I'm trying to determine where I want to go, y'all.
I think that's an interesting question because I'm not sure. Like for example, I could argue by that logic, does beer make me feel closer to God? I would actually want to take the question a totally different direction and say, what does it mean to be close to God?
Yeah.
Because if being close to God means going against this and his wisdom, then I would argue that you're not close to God.
Exactly.
So you may have a sense, like we can all have senses about, we can get tingles up our spine when we watch a scary movie or something like that, right? Or we can get a sense of God's presence that may not actually be God's presence. You're just high. Right, and you're out of your mind a little bit.
Or go this route. Like, what's a common thing that we hear in Boulder? The mountains are my church. Sure. I'm close to God when I'm in the mountains.
Right.
I'm like, okay, you can be, but that's not church.
Right.
Like, you're misunderstanding how to be with God.
For sure.
You're worshiping the wrong thing.
Right.
What are you putting your worship in?
Right.
And like I worship the mountains. Well, no, you need to worship the creator of the mountains, right?
Yeah.
Or like you don't have to go into the mountains to worship God. What about somebody who lives in, say, where I grew up, Cincinnati, Ohio,
Sure, lots
where
of
it can
mountains
be
there, right?
beautiful, but there's no mountains there, which Cincinnati is blessed this day. May I say, we drafted Joe Burrow in the draft. But I would say, like, so now it's contingent on, like, I can only be close to God if I'm high.
Sure.
That's a dangerous place to be.
Yeah, I think so too.
Right? Where it's like, oh, I can't worship unless I'm in mountains. I'm
Sure.
like, no, like, God's pretty clear that that's not how he works or operates.
For sure.
Yeah.
All right, what do we have next?
Oh man, we're getting some good ones here. The Nazarite vow also prohibited all Nazarenes from alcohol. Does that apply in any way today?
Yeah,
Chase, go for it.
Yeah, I'll take that one. This vow and kind of others like it. You'll get different vows made throughout Scripture where people didn't cut their hair or did different things to kind of signify. In fact, I'll share a silly story. When I was in college, I was trying to overcome a sin struggle in my life, and so I made a vow before God, and I shared it with another Christian brother, and I was like, I'm not going to cut my hair until I overcome this sin struggle. And so I tried to practice.
How long did your hair get?
Not very long. I made it easy for myself. But we can take kind of these biblical passages and we go, that sounds intense, that sounds serious, that's how I want to be. And then we go, I'm going to do that too. And we don't necessarily see precedent for that. We see precedent for fasting. We see precedent for making a kind of a covenant with God, making kind of commitments to honor God with our behavior. But as far as a Nazirite vow or something kind of official like that, I don't think that plays today well. I think Jesus fulfilled those covenant obligations on our behalf. So it's not necessarily a requirement for us. If you want to go ahead and practice fasting from alcohol, by all means.
Yeah.
And you might be able to experience more of God in a certain way because you're fasting.
Yeah.
But it's not so much a Nazirite vow.
Yeah. Let's take one or two more, and then we want to keep it to an hour to honor people. But one or two more here. We just got this one. Were people already drunk when Jesus performed his first miracle?
I love this question because when we were going over the passage, I wanted to bring this up.
Okay.
Because I don't know. I don't know, but you could speculate that yes.
You know somebody's uncle was.
You know somebody's uncle was.
Yeah, the guy that you only talked to at Christmas.
That's right.
You asked him to move his car.
He already had too much wine.
That's the only time you've ever talked to her. That guy had too much wine.
That's right. But no, I think the context would lend itself to say, yes, there were probably people already drunk when Jesus performed his first miracle, which means that Jesus was giving more wine to them when they were already inebriated. Now, we don't mention that to like just throw your worldview for a loop or anything. We just want to be honest with the biblical text and say, hey, that probably was reality.
Yeah, at the minimum, it's a possibility.
Yeah, for sure. Now, should that inform the way you provide alcohol to your friends? I don't know. I don't know about that.
Yeah.
Right? But I think that there's a guy that you and I both love, Steve Brown.
Yeah.
And you could go to his articles on his website about alcohol. He talks about, he's so much funnier than us, and we really respect him, but he talks about tobacco and alcohol a lot, right? And he talks about kind of this relationship that Christians have with alcohol. And I would point you there, check out, Google Steve Brown, pastor, Presbyterian pastor on alcohol. But yeah, that it's possible that they were. You want to read this last question?
Yeah, let's do this last one. If wine is okay since it is talked about in the Bible, what about beer and liquors? Well, I can go for that one.
Sure.
So one is wine is talked about more readily, but we do have some archaeological proof of things more like liquor and kind of
Strong drink.
Yeah. Forms of beer have been traced back to this time period. I don't know if that was in biblical culture.
Sure.
But I know that it existed for a long, long time.
Right.
And so, it's kind of one of those things that falls into that. I would say it falls into the alcohol category.
Right, yeah.
Of items, right? Like
for sure. Something that's going to affect your body in such a way that it's going to have physical things, flushing of the face, all this kind of stuff, where your attitude might change. And I think all those fall within that category.
Yeah, it's good.
Anything else on that one?
No.
All right, cool. Well, this has been Theology on Tap. I've had a great time discussing this stuff with you.
Yeah.
I've wanted to talk about the topic of marijuana and alcohol with Matt for a while, just because he is...
He just wanted to find out if I was still getting high.
Yeah, right.
I'm joking.
And really, I want to reiterate, as I've already reiterated a couple times already, but just to emphasize, I really wish we could be together in person, because when we're together in person, I would get to see your face and we'd get to have personal interaction. We'd hopefully get to share a beer at Upslope or somewhere here in Boulder. But we want to be a church that's receptive to God's word, that helps people live wisely, and really has conversations. And we want to have a conversation, even if you disagree with us at the end of this, totally fine. Totally fine. You're open to disagree. And that's the whole point of Theology on Tap, is that we can still love one another in Christ, even if we disagree on this issue.
Yeah, for sure.
Anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, man, I'd just say this. I'd just say, like, these are sensitive topics for some people in the midst of a struggle.
Right.
I wouldn't want anybody to think that we're being flippant with it.
Right.
We're just trying to have a good time and play around a little bit.
For sure.
And talk somewhat serious, but also not take ourselves too serious.
For sure.
But also give good, solid answers to the best of our ability, and also admit there's things that we need to learn and grow on. We're not experts in this topic.
Right.
Right. But we want to give you some help and give us a place where we can dialogue.
Right.
And discuss, agree, disagree, and know that we love Jesus at the end of the day, and that his grace is sufficient for each one of us.
For sure. The church is a great resource to reach out to if you are struggling with addiction, whether it's marijuana or alcohol. I was praying with a guy this week who shared that he feels set free from his addiction to marijuana, which was awesome. We've been praying for that for him for weeks, if not months. And so that was great news to hear. So if you are struggling, don't hesitate to reach out, seek help. Because it's really not God's best for you. We want God's best for you. So thanks so much for tuning in tonight, and see you next time for Theology on Tap. And if not then, see you at church on Sunday.
Yeah. Cheers.
Cheers.